Morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Thanks for taking the time out. I know everyone's busy, especially these days, but I appreciate you guys stopping by for a visit this morning. Appreciate you taking time out of your day. I believe this is scheduled for about an hour. We may run a little bit over depending on Q&A at the end, but my plan is to go through the presentation, handle some Q&A, at the end, and go from there. So, my name is Don Grybas. I'm president of GEMCOR. We're a third-party servicer located in the Chicago area in Illinois. We work with a couple hundred schools across the country, and we administer federal student aid, for those institutions on a third-party servicer behalf. So what I wanted to talk about today are the earnings accountability and stats rules. I'll start by saying that it's at least the Department of Ed found a new name for something. This is basically GE4, GE5, whatever you want to call it. GE's been around a long time, but the new GE standard, the new gainful employment standard, is referred to as the earnings accountability, and we're going to go through all of the details of that. Our agenda for the day is I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on a history of institutional accountability, so you guys know how we got to this point. We'll talk about the student tuition and transparency system, which is the replacement of the financial value transparency system, which is essentially reporting and consumer information disclosures. We'll talk about the earnings accountability, which will replace the gainful employment regs that have been around for a while. So these are our main topics for today. This is a big set of regulations that is technically going to go into effect next July, July of 27. But some of the provisions can be early implemented. We're going to talk about that. So, talking a little bit about history of institutional accountability. For those of you that have only been in financial aid for maybe less than 30 years, which I'm guessing is quite a few of you, you've constantly lived in an accountability environment. The Department of Ed began institutional accountability way back in 1989. And that's when the cohort default rate rules came out. Now, what's interesting to point out here is what was going on prior to 1989. Prior to 1989, there were virtually no institutional accountability regulations or rules. If you think back to that time, we had no default rates prior to 1989. We had no R2T4 rules. We had no federal refund rules at all. We had no 30-day delayed disbursement. And essentially, we were in a time where if a student attended one day and withdrew, the student would, go by the school would go by the school's institutional refund policy. And in many cases, the student owed the school 20% of the tuition, plus 100% of textbooks and materials, plus in many cases an application or registration fee and a drop fee. So we were in a time during the 70s and 80s where a student attended one day and schools often got upwards of $3,000, $4,000, sometimes $5,000. Again, no refund rules, no cohort default rate rules, and when you're in an environment where there's minimal oversight, that kind of creates an environment for some unscrupulous people. And there were quite a few of them around back then. I personally had experience with schools in the Chicago area where during the 80s, it was not uncommon for recruiters or what they called headhunters to be paid upwards of $1,000 a student for every student that they brought in. So they were bringing in, what I would refer to as the dregs of society. There was really no oversight at that schools. They had students sign documents. We're talking about largely a paper-based scenario because this is back in the 80s, and there was just a lot of abuse of the programs back then. And the department kind of woke up one day and said, the default rates are starting to get pretty high. Well, they were getting pretty high because of these practices at a number of schools out there where students were signing promissory notes and signing enrollment agreements, and they were maybe not even attending a day. There were some schools that were kind of manipulating attendance records to make it look like they were there. None of these schools that I'm talking about are still in business, so that's a good thing. But there was a huge increase in default rates because of these of these practices where students got a bunch of money. We paid first payments for Pell, sub and unsub, which back in the day were called GSLs and ALASs. And, we processed those payments, and schools legally got to keep the money because of the absence of accountability rules. So in 1989, cohort default rate rules came out. That was the first major institutional accountability measure that the Department of Ed came out with. A couple of years later, in 1992, they came out with this thing called pro rata refunds, which basically said that, hey, if a student drops, you can only charge them up to 10%. You round their enrollment up to the next 10%. So if the student was there for anywhere from 1 day to 9.9% of the program, you could charge the student 10% of the tuition. If they were there for 10.1% to 19.9%, you could charge them 20%. That was pretty quickly thrown out by the courts because the Department of Ed kind of went beyond their jurisdiction and started regulating institutional refund policies, which they can't. They can only regulate federal funds. So institutional refund policies are generally regulated by the states with accrediting agency approvals, and the courts told the department, no, you can't do that. Move forward ahead a few years to 1998, which is the department's response to the courts throwing out pro rata refund rules. And in 1998, we had R2T4. That's still around today, and largely in the same way, shape, or form that it was back in 2000. It became effective October 1st of 2000. It was in the 1998 HEA amendments, but it wasn't effective until 10/1 of 2000. And again, still around today. So the cohort default rate still around today. R2T4 still around today. And then in 2008, President Obama won his first term, and very shortly after inauguration in January of 2009, his Department of Ed began development of gainful employment regulations. That was the very first batch of gainful employment rules that came out, and they were largely targeted against career schools because they only applied to certificate and diploma programs, degree programs at for-profit schools. So, that went through some challenges in 2015. That was 2010. The 2010 gainful employment rules were again thrown out by the courts because of the department overstepping their bounds again. The original gainful employment looked for information on all of your students. The court said you can't do that because you don't have the right to maintain information on people who did not get financial aid. So it took the department a few years to come out in 2015 with GE2, which was largely the same as GE1 from 2010. They just changed the definition of student from student to FSA recipient. Now they were within their bounds to gather information because it involved federal funds. So that came out in 2015. Again, in the second Obama administration. 2016, shortly after the Gainful Employment 2 rules came out, we had a change of administration. President Trump won his first term. Very shortly after his inauguration, his Department of Education rescinded the 2015 Gainful Employment rules. So they were gone for most of that first term, for all of that first term, for that matter. Fast forward to 2020, we have a new administration. President Biden wins that election. His Department of Ed again, resurrects gainful employment. The new gainful employment rules were combined with what was called FVT, which is financial value transparency, which again was additional reporting and consumer information disclosures to give consumers as much information as possible to make a good decision about their education. So the current version of FVT GE rules came out in 2023, and it is still in place as of today. Now, 2026, just a couple months ago, we had the earnings accountability and student tuition and transparency system regulations that came out. They came out just a couple months ago, and they're intended to replace the 2023 FVT GE rules, and that will happen July 1st of 2027. So in terms of a little institutional accountability background here, this is, you see how it's kind of like an increasing scale of accountability where the department first started looking at default rates, then they went into R2T4, then they went into gainful employment. And the big difference between the 2023 FVT GE rules to the 2026 earnings accountability and stats rules is that the new 2026 earnings accountability rules are applicable to all Title IV eligible programs. So that includes degrees at public universities. It includes degrees at private nonprofit schools, because the old GE, whether it was GE1, GE2, or GE3, they were restricted to basically to for-profit or proprietary institutions. There was very little accountability on public institutions, very little accountability on private nonprofit institutions. The 2026 earnings accountability rules now apply to pretty much every institution in the country that participates in federal student aid. Now, some people might applaud that and say, well, that's great. Let's keep us all, to an equal standard. I'll demonstrate in a little bit where that expansion of the earnings accountability rules to universities, undergraduate degree programs, as well as graduate degree programs, really is not going to affect them in any way, shape, or form. And I'll show you, what I mean by that. So, student transparency, student tuition and transparency system. Again, this was regulated in conjunction with the earnings accountability rules that came out a couple months ago. Was intended to replace the financial value transparency regulations. And you guys all remember that there's reporting requirements that you guys had every September or October. Typically, the old gainful employment reports were due by October 1st. That was part of the financial value transparency regulations. This new stats system will replace financial value transparency, and it's going to become effective in July of 2027. Now, there's a master calendar requirement in the Administrative Procedures Act that says that the Department of Ed regulations that are published in final form have to be published by November 1st of a year for them to be effective the following award year. So these regulations for stats and earnings accountability came out in July of 2026. They will be effective July of 2027. Now, some of you, if your term schools out there, you might be thinking, well, hey, there's spring regulations that just came out about schedule reductions and students receiving reduced loans for not being enrolled on a full-time basis. I agree with you. Those regulations came out after November 1st of 25. They should not have been effective until July 1st of 2027, but they were effective July 1st of 2026. And that's a big issue going on. I don't want to get off on a tangent on that because that's a completely different issue, but there are provisions where the Administrative Procedures Act and the Master Calendar can be waived by, I believe it's Congress, and the regulations can be effective sooner than they would normally be under the Master Calendar. But the EA, the stats system, went under the Master Calendar rules, so they're technically going to become effective in July of 2027. Now, there's an early implementation option for institutions where you can elect to early implement the stats reporting requirements in place of the old FVT GE reporting requirements. So whether it's FVT GE or whether it's stats, these two batches of regulations in part establish the requirements for gainful employment reporting. And the purpose of that is to gather information from institutions, publish it on Department of Ed program websites, giving consumers as much information as possible on the programs that are available at an institution, the cost of those programs, and the outcomes of those programs. So stats combined with the earnings accountability rules will ultimately result in more transparency to students on tuition, programs, and those programs' accountability as measured through the earnings accountability rules. So your first stats report, the first report under the student tuition and transparency system, will be due October 1st of 27. Now, that's about 14 months off or so, and it's going to require annual submission, very, very similar to the old, or I should say current, FVT GE rules, based on the most recently completed award year. So this October of 26, stats is not going to be in official effect yet until July 1st of 27. So your 2026 reporting cycle for quote unquote gainful employment reporting is going to be based under the financial value transparency gainful employment rules that were passed in 2023, because those did not end when stats and EA were issued in final format. Again, stats and EA won't go into effect until July 1st of 27, which makes FVTGE continue through June 30th of 2027. But again, you have an option to early implement the stats-based reporting to replace your FVTGE reporting that's coming up in a couple of months. So your 2026 reporting cycle, which will be due which will be due October 1st of 2026, is referencing students for the 25-26 award year. Your gainful employment reporting, whether it's under FVTGE or whether it's under the stats rules, is generally based on the most recently completed award year. So 25-26 is the most recently completed award year. There's going to be report information that is going to go in as part of your quote unquote gainful employment reporting obligation. And you can file it under the FVTGE rules, or you can file it under the stats rules. Now, stats has eliminated a lot of the data elements for the GE reporting. So most schools are going to probably elect to early implement the stats provisions and use the stats guidelines and the stats requirements for data to fulfill their 2026 gainful employment reporting obligation, because that's coming up in a couple of months. Most of you have probably gone through the trials and tribulations of the FVTGE gainful employment reporting, with whether it was submittal spreadsheets or some other format that you were filing. There was a lot of errors, and the Department of Ed recently published a list of about close to 2,000 schools that have not successfully filed those old reports. I'll talk a little bit about that later. If you want to see what the required elements are, I have the citation there, 34 CFR 668-406. You can Google that, and it will tell you exactly, what the required data elements are. But a lot of them were eliminated. Now, because stats is not effective until July of 2027, the Department of Ed has not yet published any report designs, spreadsheets, or anything that are along the stats data requirements. So FVTGE is still out there. So when you're doing your reporting for 2026 in the next couple of months, you'll be using the template for FVTGE reporting, which is going to include all of those fields that are required under the FVTGE rules. But if you're going to early implement the stats rules, you simply ignore the columns that have been removed from stats. Now, we're going to put out another publication in a few weeks, maybe in early September, giving you guys more guidance on filing your 2026 report cycle using the stats early implementation provision. But again, you'll be using the old FVTGE spreadsheet. So if you remember those, there were TA records, there were AA records. Both systems, stats and FVTGE, require annual submission of program data, which is pretty easy. Program name, program length, CIP code, number of students enrolled, very few other items, tuition fees, book supply costs, things like that. So the program report is pretty easy. The student report under the old FVTGE system had total TA records, had AA records. It was very, very confusing, and the stats rules have really truncated that down to a lot less data. So I don't think that there's no reporting benefit to stay under the FVTGE rules, because the reporting obligation is much more cumbersome than the reporting obligation under stats. So if you look at the gainful employment reporting schedule, whether it was FVTGE based or whether it's stats based, because the current version of the FVTGE rules came out in 2023, they were effective July 1st of 2024. 2024 was the first reporting cycle under that batch of regulations. Because as the Department of Ed changed GE from 2010 to 2015 to 2023, it replaced the previous version. So reporting obligations changed, and currently we're in the 2023 FVT-GE regulations standards for reporting. That first cycle was due in October. It was October 1st of 2024, just about 3 months after the 2023 FVT-GE regulations became effective. And that first report, due 10/1 of 24, required program and student information for multiple award years because it was the first year's report under the 2023 GE cycle, but they needed more data than just the 23-24, which would be the most recently completed award year. So you had a couple of options. You see a little asterisk there under the award years reported 22-23 and 23-24. There were two options for reporting under the FVT GE rules. You had standard reporting and transitional reporting. Standard reporting included, 7 historical award years. So you would go from 23-24 all the way back to 17-18. Extremely cumbersome report. The transitional reporting option allowed schools to submit only the 2 most recent award years information, 22-23 and 23-24. So if you chose to file your first GE report back in 2024 under transitional reporting, you only had to report those 2 award years. Now, why was transitional reporting, permitted? Well, the department thought that since gainful employment had been around so long, schools that were proactive throughout GE1, GE2, and into GE3, if schools were proactive in reducing their tuition cost and reducing student debt, then the old years would do nothing but harm them. So they allowed the schools to do transitional reporting with only the 2 most recent years, which would reflect potentially reduced costs and additional proactive attempts by the school to recognize GE and reduce overall student debt. Because we were talking about program accountability and student debt at the time. So transitional reporting had 2 years, program and student information. That was in October of 24. Jump up another year, 2025, just this past year, your 2025 FVT GE report included information for the most recently completed award year. That would have been 24-25, program and student information. That would have been due by 10/1 of 25. Now I've got 2 asterisks next to these 2 reporting cycles, the very first and second ones under FVT GE. Schools had tremendous problems, and there's still, like I said, almost 2,000 schools that haven't successfully reported at least a portion, if not all, of the 2024 and 2025 reporting cycles. So the Department of Ed extended those initial October 1 deadlines, by several months, then again by several months, then to 9/30 of 25, and then ultimately and just recently, with the implementation of potentially early stats on the 2026 rules, the Department of Ed said, hey, we're giving you one last attempt. We're publishing a spreadsheet of schools that, are missing files. We're telling you what's missing, whether it's the, 22-23 student file, the 23-24 program file, whatever it is. We shared this spreadsheet with our clients. I know we've got a number of people here who are not clients. Welcome. I'm happy to share that with you guys or direct you to the Ed website that has it, but it has all 7 categories of what you had to file under the 2024 and 2025 FVT GE reporting obligations. It tells you exactly what you're missing. So the Department of Ed released this information a short time ago, and they said, schools, you've got until January 15th of 2027 to straighten this out. So we have another extension to both 24 and 25 reporting cycles, giving you guys until January 15th of 2027. That's the new and allegedly last deadline that you're going to get, although the Department of Ed said some other deadlines were the last deadline, and they continue to extend it a little bit. They want this data. So they're kicking the can down the road as much as they can. But personally, I don't think anyone's going to get any extensions beyond January 15th of 2027. So keep that in the back of your mind. Review your old reporting for 24 and 25. Make sure it's all complete. If not, you got to get it done by January 15th of 2027. That's going to be the end all be all. Now, currently, we're in the 2026 reporting cycle. That report is due 10/1 of 26. There are no extensions to that. So we're in an area where you've got your current year report that's going to be due in a couple months, but then the 2 year prior reports are not technically due for another 5 months. So it's kind of weird that we've got a current reporting obligation due before an older reporting obligation, but that's the area that we're in right now. And it's good that the department gave schools all the way until January of 27 to straighten out the first two. And I think that is kind of an indication that they know that there's problems. They know that it's a challenge. So, you have some time to get that done. Your 2026 reporting obligation is going to be due 10/1 of 26. There's currently no extensions on that. It's going to include program and student data for the 25-26 award year. And you can file it under the current FBT GE rules, which would be the same old submittal spreadsheets that you guys did for 24 and 25, or you can elect to early implement the stats rules. And again, there's nothing special you have to do with that. You don't have to send anything to the Department of Ed saying, oh, I'm early implementing, the stats rules. The Department of Ed will look at your report for the 2026 cycle, and if it includes all of the data in those in the old format, the old FBT GE format, that's going to be interpreted as you staying under the FBT GE reporting guidelines. If any of the columns are missing, if you elect to omit, one or all of the excluded columns that were under the stats rules, then the Department of Ed will consider you as early implementing the stats. So again, same spreadsheet. It may be a little confusing, so you guys need to not wait until the last week in September to get this done. You can go on to NSLDS. The reports can be done by, if you're a larger school, batch submission. Your IT department may have batch submission capability. Most schools do them under the spreadsheet submittal, which is available in the NSLDS Professional Access website. There's also a management tab, I'm told. I haven't been out there to see it myself, but you can file it also, online. But generally, the submittal spreadsheet is the way that schools, reported 24 and 25. I don't know if you'll get as many errors because, again, you'll be eliminating a lot of the columns that are not required under the stats rules. So that's where we are right now. We've got a reporting obligation 10/1 of 26. That'll be for the 25-26 year exclusively. Again, program record, easy stuff. Student information, that would be students who were FSA recipients. Again, every time you see student in terms of GE, it's FSA recipient. It's not all students. So, GEMCOR clients can go out into team. You guys can run a report of 25-26 cumulative awards that have been paid. You can export that, into spreadsheet or PDF to get an idea of what your population is. And we can also potentially provide some additional information. We're going to look at being able to export some other fields if we can to get that report done. But it's going to be tough because, again, there's the option of old FBT GE, there's the option of early stats implementation. But the bottom line is know what your population is, which is your FSA recipients during 25-26. You'll have to report general student information, but you're not going to have to report a lot of the private education loans, a lot of the the residency issues. There's about 30% of the data under the old FBT GE reporting standards have been eliminated under the stats reporting standards. And again, we'll put more information out about that. 2027 stats report will be due next year, 10/1 of 27. So you can see on the left column here the year reporting cycle, what set of regulations it follows, and what the deadline is. So again, I stress the 26 year is due October 1st. There's currently no plans for extension. The past 25 and 24 reporting cycles, schools have until January 15th of 2027 to get that straightened out if there's anything missing. And again, there's that spreadsheet the Department of Ed published to let you know what institutions have missed on their old reporting. So again, the stats system, also requires publication to a link of the Department of Ed's program website, along with your consumer information disclosures. Again, this whole thing is transparency. It's in the name of the regulations. It's about providing consumers more information so prospective students have a better opportunity to make an educated decision on their career path in terms of the program length, the cost, and again, whether it meets certain outcomes. So that's basically it on stats. It's more of a reporting obligation, and it changes everything from the old GE reports to the new standard. I've looked at it pretty closely. It's a benefit to most schools. Stats is a much more limited reporting obligation than the old FBT GE is. So for those of you considering whether you want to early implement stats or not, I do recommend it because, again, it will make your life easier this year. Your difficult part is going to be going back to 24 and 25 and straightening out those years by the January 2027 deadline. In conjunction with stats came the earnings accountability rules. Earnings accountability is the new GE. It's the new gainful employment. So whether you've heard it as earnings accountability, program accountability, new gainful employment, those terms are all synonymous. It's all the same thing. The earnings accountability rules came out just about 6 weeks ago, July 1st of 2026, again, intended to replace the old GE regulations. And that will happen when the earnings accountability rules go into effect on 7/1 of 27. Basic concept is really simple, folks. Your completers have to earn at least as much money as someone with only a high school diploma. So the general concept is pretty easy. Anybody in an undergraduate program, and again, keep in mind that the earnings accountability rules have now been expanded to all institutions and all programs that are eligible for federal student aid. So you've got certificate programs at the undergraduate level, you've got associate degree programs and bachelor degree programs at the undergraduate level, you've got master's degree programs, doctorate programs at the graduate level. All of those programs at all institutions are now subject to the earnings accountability standards. So the way the Department of Ed set it up is they expect the completers of your program, and it's reviewed by what the Department of Ed calls gainful employment program. So it would be your school's OPE ID number, the 6-digit CIP code of that program, the credential level. So if you have if you have an engineering program or an HVAC program or whatever that has both a certificate credential as well as an associate degree credential, those two programs are treated separately, and they will have different earnings accountability rules. But basically, completers of any undergraduate certificate or degree program have to earn at least as much as somebody with only a high school diploma or its equivalent. Completers of graduate degree programs have to earn at least as much as somebody that has a bachelor's degree, so it's going to be the one lower credential. The biggest problem that I have with earnings accountability, and what I think really kind of throws the gratitude to the department for expanding this to all institutions in the garbage, is the elimination of the debt to earnings requirement. Under each version of GE prior to 2026's earnings accountability rules, the debt to earnings measurement was a test. We had to get the debt on your students, both federal debt that the Department of Ed already knows about, plus the private education debt, institutional loans, institutional debt on withdrawals, which again is probably the one main thing that was eliminated from the stats rules, is that institutional debt, which was very difficult for schools to calculate for withdrawals. You almost had to look at every single student, see what they owed to you, and report that as institutional debt on the old GE reporting under the FBT GE rules. The stats rules eliminate that. So that in and of itself is probably enough reason to early implement the stats rules. But when there was a debt to earnings requirement, we got all of the student debt that they incurred going to this particular program. We determined what the annual payment on that debt would be, and it had to be less than 8% of the median earnings of people in that credential, in that program. So there was a measurement to debt to earnings. So why am I so frustrated that the debt to earnings requirement was eliminated? I applaud the elimination of it to make accountability regulations a little bit easier. We only have one earnings test, and it's right up here in the basic concept that your completers of your programs have to earn more, or at least as much or more than somebody with just a high school diploma. It's a pretty easy standard. It's a pretty easy calculation if the numbers are accurate. The debt to earnings was much more complex. So, I applaud getting rid of that. But the problem that I have is eliminating the debt to earnings requirement does absolutely nothing to control excessive cost at large universities for useless degree programs. We all hear stories out there. There's students that are leaving school with a bachelor's degree. They're 100,000 plus in debt. And under the new earnings accountability standards, as long as that student is earning at least as much as somebody with a high school diploma or a GED, that program passes. And that's the problem that I have with it. So it's nice that the department saw the inequity and the discrimination in the old GE rules that were largely focused at proprietary schools under the gainful employment, words in the statute. It's nice that they said, okay, yeah, we've heard your cries. We're now gonna put earnings accountability rules and assess them on all schools. Look how good we are. We're gonna make sure that everybody follows the same rules. But I think it's not much of a requirement to expect someone that graduates with a bachelor's degree to earn as much as somebody with a high school diploma. And the truth of the matter is that student who has a bachelor's degree, as long as they're making, let's say $40,000 a year, maybe $35,000, depending on what state you're in terms of what the high school graduate income rate is. The department has no problem with that, even if the student is $150,000 in debt. So that's the big problem that I have with the earnings accountability rules eliminating the debt to earnings, requirement. But it is what it is. So we've got a basic concept that your graduates have to earn at least as much as somebody with just a high school diploma or its equivalent. And you'll see different words that sound, they sound a little, scary. Earnings premiums and earnings thresholds and, what are all these things? It seems very, very, very confusing. It's not. I can explain it in just a couple sentences looking at the bottom line of my screen here. The earnings threshold is what adult workers who have a high school diploma or its equivalent, what their median income is. That's the threshold. So if you look at the threshold as in your house, on the floor, you want to cross over from one room into another. There's a threshold there. Well, you either have to stand on it and be equal to it, or you have to step over it. Then you get in, then you succeed. You get into the next room. Same concept here. The earnings threshold is the number that your graduate's income is going to be measured against. And if your graduate's income is at least equal to or greater than the earnings threshold, that's an earnings premium, meaning the student is not harmed by going to your program. They're earning at least as much as someone with a high school diploma. That's the threshold. And if your graduates earn more than that, that's an earnings premium. So the calculation is a simple A minus B. We're going to get the income of your graduates, and we're going to subtract B, which is the earnings threshold. And if that end result is a positive number or zero, you're good. So the calculation is much easier than it was under the old GE rules that had pretty complex debt to earnings calculations. And if we go back to old GE, we had not only debt to earnings, but we had debt to discretionary income, which was another test. We had repayment rates, which was another test. And it's really comical, what has gone on over the past 16 years with this particular topic of accountability in the programs that you're offering. So as I said, the earnings threshold, it's the median annual earnings of the general public, which is going to be compared to the median annual earnings of your program completers. So in terms of undergraduate programs, this would include all certificate programs. It would include associate degree programs, bachelor degree programs at all institutions. The benchmark that those graduates' earnings have to meet will be the median income of working adults ages 25 to 34 that have only a high school diploma or a recognized equivalent, and who also were not enrolled in an eligible institution during that tax year, because if they were enrolled in an institution during that tax year, they're obviously not working, so they're excluding that information. Now, this threshold is going to be determined on a state-by-state basis. It's also going to be determined on a national basis. So what you have to do, your program graduates, their income is going to be analyzed by the Department of Ed. We're going to get a median annual earnings amount. That concept has been the same in all of the past versions of GE. There was always a median annual earnings number to look at. So we'll get the median annual earnings of your graduates in a particular, cohort. We're going to compare that to the median annual earnings of people with only a high school diploma, age 25 to 34, that are working adults. And you're going to have to meet that standard in your state, unless more than 50% of your students are enrolled from out of state. So if you're, on the border of a couple of different states, or if you have, maybe distance ed programs where you're enrolling students from many different states, bottom line is if more than 50% of your enrollments are out of state enrollments, and when I say out of state, I mean the state in which the school is physically located, then your programs will have to match a national standard of income of working adults age 25 to 34 who have only a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. So there's two tests that the department is going to have. It's going to be a test state by state. So you're going to be comparing apples to apples. If you're in California, it's going to be compared to a California people who have a high school diploma or its equivalent. If you're in Kentucky, it's going to be measured against Kentucky. Again, unless you have more than 50% of your enrollments from out of state, then the examination is going to be based on the national average, or I should say national median earnings of working adults age 25 to 34. This information is going to be gathered from the Census Bureau. Another problem I have with this, we're kind of comparing apples to oranges. The Department of Ed is going to go to the Census Bureau to get information on the earnings threshold, but then to get the earnings for your past graduates, they're pulling that from the IRS. So it's really not an apples to apples comparison. Is any of this going to be challenged in court? Quite possibly. GE was challenged in court all the way back to 2010. And it's likely to continue to be challenged. But this is what we have to go on right now. The earnings threshold, again, which is the benchmark that your graduates have to be at. Your graduates have to be earning at least as much as this earnings threshold. And another, problem that I have with it is you're looking at, the median earnings of working adults aged 25 to 34 who have only a high school diploma. They're going to be compared against your graduates. Now, I will say that the income of your graduates is not going to be measured until 4 years post-graduation. So it's not like your students are going out fresh, they're starting their careers, and their income is immediately examined. No, it's going to be 4 years post-graduation. So it does give them time to get a little bit of experience under their belt and hopefully earn, a little bit more than they would straight out of school. But we're comparing that standard of your graduates 4 years after graduation to potentially somebody who's been in the workforce for 15 years, that, is in their early 30s. They have only a high school diploma, maybe a GED. They started working immediately after, school was over, after high school was over, or maybe they left high school and they got a GED. But the bottom line is you could have people out in the workforce that are upwards of, mid-30s working in industries for 13, 14, 15, 16 years, and they're going to have pretty substantial income, especially if they're in unions. So, I think it's going to be interesting to find out what these numbers are. I've seen some of them. If you guys go out to the collegescorecard.ed.gov website, you can search different programs. That publication has national earnings for high school graduates. It has, earnings on all kinds of different, different numbers. A couple that I looked at, I think the national average right now for working adults in median annual earnings is about 26,400, somewhere around there. So if you're going to be held to the national standard because more than 50% of your enrollments are from out of state, it's looking like with current information published that threshold is going to be about 26.4. It may change. I don't know how old the information was in the Census Bureau that I saw. A number of states have higher incomes. Some states have lower incomes, but you can go out there and bounce around and see what's out there now. And I don't know if those are the same numbers that the Department of Ed is going to be using, but there's some problems with this calculation. It's not a perfect world. I really wish that if we're analyzing program accountability and outcomes, it was program outcomes and not earnings, because earnings are largely based on the individual worker, and your job is to train them and put them out in the workforce, not necessarily manage them while they're working. So their income is largely going to be dependent on their supervisor in their field when they're working. Your job is just to get them trained. So I would much rather see an accountability measure on outcomes, your graduation rates, your placement rates, things like that. I think our whole industry has been fighting for that, but it hasn't happened, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. So in terms of, we know the threshold. That's going to be the median annual earnings of people with just a high school diploma, age 25 to age 24 to 35. The median annual earnings of your program completers is going to be obtained from the IRS. So again, we've got your income for your graduates coming from the IRS, the benchmark being compared to from the Census Bureau, not really an apples to apples comparison in my mind. The first publication of the earnings accountability results is going to be next year, because again, these regulations don't technically go into effect until July 1st of 27. But how they're going to determine the cohort of those graduates, like I said, they're going to look at a group of your graduates, compare their median annual earnings to this earnings threshold benchmark from the Census Bureau. So the first report that will come out of the earnings accountability rules, the first measure, is going to come out in 2027. And it's going to be based on an earnings year of 2025. The reason they do that is, 2025 tax year ends 12/31/25. Generally, people have until April 15th of 26 to file their taxes, October 15th of 26 if you get the extension. So the Department of Ed really doesn't have all of the information, or I should say the IRS, excuse me, doesn't have all of the information on a particular tax year until after mid-October of the following year. So that's why 25 is being used for the 27 publication, because you can't use 26 for a 27 publication because there's not enough time to allow people to file their 26 taxes into October of 27 and then use that 26 tax year for a publication in summer of 27. So, it goes back, 2 years on the tax year. So the earnings year or the tax year is going to be 2025. The award year of the program completers that the Department of Ed is going to look at, the cohort, is going to be 2021 graduates. So this information may be in the department system. They'll pull it from NSLDS. You guys know every 60 days you go into NSLDS and you do your enrollment roster, and you update graduation dates and drop dates and all this other stuff. So the Department of Ed knows exactly who your program completers are for the 2021 award year. That's going to be coming out to you in your completers list. But before they send out a completers list, they have to determine what the cohort is, because the cohort is based on a number of different factors, and the cohort has to be at least 30 students. So the 25 tax year, which is going to be used for next year's publication, is going to be based on 2021 graduates, because again, they're looking at income 4 years post-graduation. So people who graduated during 2021 have worked for at least 4 years, for income in 2025. The 6-digit program CIP code, as an example, I've got 12.3456. So, your SIP code for that program for your 2021 grads, if you have at least 30 completers, that's your cohort. So, you might have a massage therapy program, medical assisting program, whatever, cosmetology program. And if you have at least 30 completers during the 2021 award year at that 6-digit CIP code, then you will have your cohort. The cohort expansion is not required. You've got the 30 completers. So that group of 30 completers is going to be in your completers list. This will be sent to you. You'll be able to review it, and maybe exclude students if they, were back in school, if they passed away. There's a number of different exclusions that are out there. Not too many, but some students can be excluded from that cohort. That cohort is going to be sent to the IRS. The IRS is going to run those Social Security numbers and get the income of those that are working in that 25, year. And they're going to determine what the median annual earnings. So if you have 30, they're going to, and let's say they come back with 20 people in that cohort that have tax information that was filed for 25. They're going to sort those numerically. They're going to pick the middle record. That's going to be the median annual earnings of that particular cohort. And only that is going to go to the department back from the IRS. Because the IRS and the department have always fought for years on what information to share and this and that. IRS is very concerned about financial privacy and not releasing data that people don't have access to. So, the IRS said, sure, we'll help you out with this, but we're not going to give you all of the incomes on all of the people in the cohort and then let you play around with it. We'll determine the median number and we'll just send that back to you. Another little problem I have with this. I mean, there's no accountability on that end. How do we know that that information is accurate? But if you don't have 30 completers at that 6-digit CIP code for 2021, then it requires cohort expansion because we need at least 30 records to be a representative sample. So what they'll do is they'll go back 1 year to the next row to 1920 graduates. Now, those that graduated in 1920 on the same 6-digit CIP code will have their income looked at from 2024. Because again, it's income 4 years post-graduation. So we could have the first group of students at this 6-digit CIP code, let's say there's 12 of them. Was there 30? No, we had to expand. Now we go into the 1920 graduates. The IRS is going to look at their incomes from 2024. Let's say there's, another 20 of those. Well, okay, combine the first two categories. You've got 30 completers. That's my cohort. Let's say you still don't have 30 completers. Now you move to level 3, which is going to be an expansion of 2 more award years. So now we'll have the 2021 grads, the 1920 grads, the 1819, and the 1718 grads. Now the 1819 grads, they're going to be looking at 2023 income. Again, income 4 years post-graduation. The 1718 grads, the IRS is going to be looking at 22 income. Again, all at the same 6-digit CIP code. So we add those 3 categories together. Do we have 30 completers? Yes? Cool. You got your cohort. That's going to go to the IRS to determine the median annual earnings. If you don't, we go one more step. And here's where it really gets problematic. So really, really small schools that offer multiple programs, you're going to have a bit of a problem, and here's why. If we have to get into this 4th expansion, we're going to take not only the 2021 grads plus the 1920 grads at those 6-digit CIP codes, plus the 1819 and 1718 grads at that same 6-digit CIP code, and the last expansion is going to be all 4 of those award years for students in programs with the same 4-digit CIP code. So let's say you have a barbering program that's 12.0402, and then you've got a skincare program that's 12.0409. Well, those 6-digit CIP codes will have their own unique cohorts if they get to 30 completers. But if it's a small school and they don't, then your median annual earnings at this 4th line here could be based on graduates of the last 4, not the last, but 4 award years from 2021 prior, combined in the barber and the skincare program, which share the 12.04 4-digit CIP code. So this expansion, there's not going to be too many schools that will not have 30 after the 4th expansion. If you don't, then it's a really, really small school, and I don't think there's going to be an earnings accountability test on you at all. But it's a bit complex for smaller schools to determine what that cohort is. This screen shows you what that cohort is going to be, and it's going to be for all programs at your school at the same credential level. So if you are offering certificate and associate degree and bachelor degree programs, certificate, associate, and bachelor degree are three different credential categories. So this analysis is going to be done within each of those credential level categories. So we've got the cohort of graduates. The IRS is going to determine the median income in the particular tax years for that cohort. It's going to be compared to the earnings threshold, which is pulled from the Census Bureau, and A minus B. If that earnings premium number is negative, it means that your graduate's income is less than the earnings threshold. That's going to fail. If your earnings, if your graduate's earnings of the cohort are equal to or greater than the earnings threshold, that's going to be a positive earnings premium, and your program will pass. The calculation is that simple. Getting there is the hard part. Now, there's probably a bunch of people out here that offer programs leading to occupations that are what's called tip sensitive. A significant amount of tip revenue is involved. So we have a 1-year delay. ED's authorized a 1-year delay to any earnings accountability standards for programs that lead to significant tip income occupations. Cosmetology and related fields, massage therapy, casino operations have already been announced by the department. They have a link on their website of what all of them are. Why did they do this? It's tied into the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, which came out. That was the commonly referred to as the No Tax on Tip campaign. This piece of legislation allows people to exclude up to $25,000 of tip income from federal income taxes. So that's the No Tax on Tips campaign. It's effective with the 2026 tax year. And if you notice back on this screen, next year's publication is going to be based on the 25 tax year. So the Department of Ed thought it would be reasonable to delay the consequences for any programs that lead to occupations that have a significant amount of tip revenue until the 26 earnings year is examined, which will be released in 2028, because their argument is, hey, 2026, they didn't have to pay tax on their tips. The income should be more accurate. And I think there's some truth to that. I think the income might be a little more accurate. I do think that there's still people out there that will just not report their tips. Fortunately, we're living in more and more of an electronic society. Fewer people are carrying cash with them. So I always do. So I'm still a cash tipper, but there's a lot of people that will just tip on credit cards. Those are obviously, taken into account on the W-2 for that worker. But I still think there's people that are going to underreport, tip revenue, even if they're not taxed on it for other reasons. A whole bunch of tax credits get phased out at certain levels of income. So if there are other tax credits that somebody is getting because they are a lower income family, they're not going to want to jeopardize that by reporting extra tip revenue, even though they're not going to be incurring federal income tax on that tip revenue. If they're going to lose other tax benefits and other subsidies, there's no reason for the person to report that. So I do think that there'll be a little bit more accurate information on incomes from 26 moving forward because of the no tax on tips. But I still think that there's going to be a lot of underreported revenue. So what happens if you fail? Well, if you fail the premium test in 2 out of 3 consecutive years, you're labeled as a low earnings outcome program, and the program loses FDSL eligibility. So one good thing is that it's loss of FDSL, not loss of all Title IV in general, which was the standard under the old GE rules. However, if over a 3-year period, if more than 50% of your students are enrolled in low earnings outcome programs, or if more than 50% of your FSA volume is in low earnings outcome programs from a number of different CIP codes and cohorts, then you will be subject to loss of Pell also. So you'll be subject to loss of all FSA. So initially, it's going to be a loss of FDSL. but potentially could be a loss of all Title IV if you hit those 50% standards, where more than 50% of your students or revenue comes from underperforming programs. There's warnings. Once you get a first earnings premium failure, there's warnings that you have to provide to current prospective students, anybody working on behalf of a prospective student. You have to provide them warnings within 30 days of you receiving notice from the department that you failed the test for a particular year. You have to provide additional warnings to students if they're not going to enroll for another 12 months. Let's say you're talking to them, you give them the warning, you don't see them, they enroll 15 months later, you got to give them another warning. Warnings can be electronic, they can be hard copy, they can be verbally for prospective students. I caution you there, because there's no proof that you provided it to them if you give it to them verbally. So even though that's stipulated in the regs, there's other requirements that a student has to acknowledge obtaining that warning, so you may not want to be doing it verbally, but the option is there for prospective students. The particular warning language can be the only substantive content of that communication. So you can't send an email to a student saying, hey, thanks for your interest in our school, here's our blah, 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 and give them all kinds of information, and then a tiny little footnote at the bottom. Oh, by the way, here's warnings. No, you can't do that. It has to be the only substantive content in that particular communication with the student. And the prospective students cannot be enrolled or incur any kind of financial commitment with the school for at least 3 days after you provided the warning. Again, these warnings come out similar to the old FET GE warning requirements after the program reaches its first year failure. Here's what the programs have to include: a basic statement that the program didn't meet the test, information on the Department of Ed's program website. The student has to acknowledge receiving that warning before you can disperse any funds. So an additional obligation on your admissions departments, financial aid departments, if you have failed an earnings premium measurement, you're going to have to abide by these particular warnings. A more difficult one, more burdensome for Pell, you got to provide them with their remaining Pell lifetime eligibility. Now, it's visible on the ICER. If you're a GEMCOR client in our team system, the details box on the right-hand side of the screen when you're looking at a student to package them has their Pell LEU or lifetime eligibility used. So your warnings for Pell recipients have to include what their remaining lifetime eligibility is, and that future Pell disbursements in the low earnings program that they're in could or will go against that lifetime eligibility. And you have to provide that notice, that warning, with every disbursement of Pell. That's going to be cumbersome down the line once the program reaches a one-year fail. So let's say you get a first year report, first year earnings next year, or whatever the year after that, if it's a 1 year delay, and your program fails the earnings threshold. You're not equal to or greater than the median annual earnings of people 24 to 35 that have only a high school diploma or equivalent. You could do nothing. You could just say, oh, shoot, I didn't meet it. Okay, I got warnings I got to do. I got to get that warning process in place and make sure I follow those requirements. And then you could just continue about your merry way, knowing that the next year's publication that comes out, if you fail the standard, you're now going to fail 2 out of 3 consecutive years, and you'll be subject to loss of FDSL eligibility, potentially loss of all Title IV if more than 50% of your students or revenue come from underperforming programs. But that is an option. You can just do nothing, and I don't want to say completely do nothing. Obviously, there's the warnings and things that you have to do, but do nothing in terms of the low earnings outcome program. The EA regulations give you an opportunity for an orderly program closure, where you can just say, okay, I failed the standard. I'm going to stop enrolling new students, and I'm just going to teach out the ones that I have. That's an option. The department will then allow those currently enrolled students to remain eligible for FDSL throughout the completion of their training. It's limited to the end of the program or 3 years, whichever is shorter. For most people here, it's going to be the end of the program, but those students will not lose FDSL eligibility as long as you cease enrolling new students and you start working on what's called an orderly program closure. You're saying, okay, this is a low earnings program. I'm not going to offer it anymore. Third thing that you could do is completely end FDSL participation for that program. If that's the case, it's going to last 5 years. So, if you do that, you won't lose any other FSA, regardless of what percentage of students are enrolled in low earnings outcome programs. If you're going to end FDSL participation in the programs that fail the earnings premium measurement, that loss of eligibility extends for 5 years, but it kind of shelters your other FSA funds. If you don't do anything and the second year report comes out and you fail that one, now you're ineligible, and that period of ineligibility extends for 2 years. So if you're going to choose to end FDSL participation, that's going to be a 5-year commitment, but it will shelter your other FSA funds. If you don't do anything and the program loses eligibility, that would be for only 2 years, but that loss of eligibility could also affect Pell if more than half of your students are in low earnings outcome programs. So here's a timeline of next year's, the very first publication of the earnings accountability timeline. We're talking about the 2027 publication year. That's when this test is going to be published, and whether you pass or fail. It's going to be based on the 2025 tax year, as was shown in the other slide. It's going to include 2021 completers cohort. Now that's subject to expansion, because again, if you don't have at least 30 in the 2021 completers cohort by 6-digit CIP code, it could be expanded to other years graduates and potentially other CIP code programs. But this coming year, January 27, about 4 months away or so, you're going to get the list of completers that are based on this cohort for the 2027 publication year. And again, that's going to be 2021 graduates of your programs by CIP code, by credential level, with expansion if necessary for small schools. So you'll be able to review that and confirm it for accuracy. A few months after that, Ed's going to obtain the median earnings of from the IRS of the people in that, of the completers in that cohort. It's going to compare that to the earnings threshold, which they're going to get from the Census Bureau. And your earnings premium is going to be determined at that point. And if it's 0 or positive, you're good. If it's negative, you fail. So shortly thereafter, after they do that analysis in spring of 27, in around July 27, we expect the first earnings accountability results to come out. There's going to be no loss of eligibility for anybody. And I haven't confirmed whether schools that are in the 1 year grace period for tip revenues, if you have to abide by the warnings or not. From what I've read, you're exempt from earnings accountability consequences for this 1 year if you have programs leading to tip sensitive occupations. And if I see the words earnings accountability consequences, the warnings are part of those earnings accountability consequences. So that's just kind of me looking at it. I think it's an educated, guess on the fact that you won't have to do anything next year if you're offering programs in those tip sensitive occupations. But again, I haven't seen anything verbatim from the department yet that says you don't have to do the warnings. Shortly after your results are released, you'll have the opportunity to either take no action, start an immediate orderly program closure, or withdraw from FDSL. You'll have those options. So if you decide, no, I'm not going to do anything, I think next year is going to be good, you certainly have that, have that ability. Again, in the background, this whole year is going to be kind of a wash for programs that lead to tip sensitive occupations because of the Working Families Tax Cuts Act and the no tax on tips issue that doesn't start until the 26th tax year, whereas this is the 25. Next October, your first stats report is going to be due. That's 14 months from now. Just like the past GE reporting rules, it's going to require program and student information for the most recently completed award year. November of 27. Now you'll see that the timeline is escalated a little bit. You're going to get your completers cohort for the 27 publication in January of 27. but the department expects to move that up a few months. And by November of 27, you're going to have the completers list for the 2028 cohort publication. Now, that 2028 cohort is going to use 2026 income. So your 1 year waiver on tip sensitive incomes is now gone because the 26 income is being used in your 28 cohort, and the no tax on tips was in effect that year. It's going to be based on the 21-22 graduate cohort, subject to expansion if you don't have 30 students. So your 21-22 graduates, by program, CIP code, credential, if there's 30 or more, that's going to be your cohort for those of you running programs that lead to tip sensitive occupations. That's going to be the first cohort that can actually cause you some trouble. And then in spring of 27, the second publication of earnings accountability results is going to be, sent out. And at that point, 2 years have been released because we released the first year in July of 27. Spring of 28, they're expecting the second release. You could face loss of FDSL eligibility if you failed both publications and your programs don't lead to occupations with a lot of tip revenue, because again, there's a 1 year waiver on all those programs. Okay, so this is our cohort. I went a little bit over, but I think there was a lot of information to provide. Tara, if you're still with us, are there any questions that have come up?
Okay, first question, will this recording be emailed to us? And yes, once we're finished here, we will publish the recording, and then it will send you out an automatic email with the recording to your email that you registered with.
Yeah, in terms of the report, you're not going to get any other information from the department. So yeah, nothing's going to be emailed to you. You're going to have to identify who those students are. The submittal spreadsheet is available in the NSLDS website. So if you log in under professional access in NSLDS, there's going to be I don't know if they reworded the tab from FBT GE to earnings accountability or stats, probably not, but you're looking for the gainful employment tab in the NSLDS system, and you should find the submittal spreadsheets there. And what you'll have to do is kind of copy and paste information. We will try to get a submittal spreadsheet from the Department of Education and put it out to you guys if you're having trouble getting it from the NSLDS website. But that's going to be the best way for people to do it. And you have to be proactive. You're not going to get anything from the department other than the guidance on your report being due. You have all the information, or if you're not a GEMCOR client and you're participating and you want that spreadsheet of schools that failed to comply with 24 and 25, shoot me an email, don@gemcorinc.com. I'll be happy to send it out to you guys. But you're logging into NSLDS to both file the new GE report for October of 26, as well as to look at your 24 and your 25 cycles.
Okay, another question here. Where can we find what columns of the spreadsheet need to be completed for submission on 10/1/26?
I shared that link earlier. It was 34 CFR, I believe 668-603. Let me go back to my presentation. Yeah, 34 CFR 668.406. That's the regulatory citation for the data elements. And I also have been told that the Department of Ed is going to release some additional information as well. Now, in the mind of the Department of Ed, the stats and EA rules were published July of 26. They don't go into effect until July 27. Even though there's early implementation. So the Department of Ed is fixated on, this is effective July 27. So we're putting that on the calendar in terms of getting information out. So the information is coming on a very slow basis from the Department of Education because this is technically not effective until July 1 of 27. but the early implementation rules allow you guys to implement that early. So I have been, the department has said that they're going to release additional information. I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, another question. How and when were schools notified about the FFV GE reports that were not completed from previous years, or where can we find this information?
That information is available at the Knowledge Center in Partner Connect. The Department of Ed sent out, I think it was EA 26-49 about reporting. It just came out in August, I believe. We did a large email on it, and we provided that information. If you're not currently a GEMCOR client, then obviously you would not have gotten that information from us. But the department they just publish things to the Knowledge Center, Dear Colleague letters, electronic announcements, and unless you're signed up for the Saturday email from Partner Connect that says, "Oh, hey, here's the list of things that we published, this week." If you're not signed up for that release, then short of you guys logging into Partner Connect every day and looking at publications, there's going to be no other way for you to find that. So that's one thing I recommend anybody who's not getting, Saturday emails from FSA Partner Connect that shows all the publications, that came out that week, to get yourself on that. You can log into the Knowledge Center and sign up for that way. But that information is there. If you have any trouble, everybody, just have my email address, don@gemcorinc.com. I'm happy to share with you what I have.
Okay, a couple of people are asking if we're going to be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint, and I can do that once we wrap up here. I can send out a PDF to attendees of the PowerPoint, definitely. And I think that's all we have in the Q&A box. Maybe we'll give it another minute to see if any last minute questions come in.
Okay, while we're giving that a minute or so, let me express my thanks to everybody who took time out of their day. I know there's a lot of stuff to do. This is a very complex and cumbersome industry, but thank you for attending. I hope to see you guys again. I'll let Tara close after checking the chat box. But again, happy to answer any questions. Feel free to shoot either of us an email as time goes on, and we'll do our best to put you guys in the right direction.
One more question came in. Can schools go on to NSLDS and report the stats electronically?
Yes, in the Department of Ed publication, there is, I think they use the term management. There's a management tab, something in NSLDS. So, as a servicer, I don't have direct NSLDS professional access login because that's reserved for schools. So I don't necessarily see the screens unless I get with a client and we do a Zoom and they share their screen and I can learn a little bit. But in the NSLDS professional access website, I know that there's a gainful employment area. I know that the submittal spreadsheets are done through that gainful employment tab in professional access. And I'm also told that there's an ability to do them online electronically, and the Department of Ed referred to a management screen or a management tab. I personally haven't seen it myself. Another form of electronic submission is the batch submission. And if you're a larger school, you can submit this information in a fixed file in accordance with the Department of Ed's record format guidelines. You can upload it through your TG mailbox or your FT mailbox in through EdConnect. So there's three ways to report it. You've got the batch process, which you have to sign up for through SAG. You have the NSLDS professional access, which allows you to do both the submittal spreadsheet and I believe like a online / real-time filing.
Okay, one more question. Was there a completers list in January of 2026?
I don't believe so. Yeah, I don't believe so. Because the the current GE that came out in 2024 had a first reporting cycle in 2024. I know the department has said that, hey, you're going to get a completers list. I don't want to answer definitively with an absolute no, but my recollection is that I don't remember seeing a completers list, for that.
Okay, yep, that
There's
looks like.
also there's also questions on, whether the GE tests are going to be rolled over into EA. For example, we know that both sets of rules said that if you fail 2 out of 3 consecutive years tests, will you lose eligibility? Well, we have the FET GE that has been going on since 2024, published in 2023, effective in 2024, and the earnings premiums first test are going to come out in 2027. So if you failed the last publication from the GE standards and you fail the first publication from the EA standards, is that going to be considered 2 out of 3 consecutive years? The department has not been very specific with that analysis, but what I have seen in Department of Ed publications is that the first earnings accountability release next summer will have no sanctions on schools. And I'm not a lawyer, but that makes sense to me, because if you have one set of regulations that says 2 out of 3 years under this set, and then another set of regulations that says 2 out of 3 years in this set, and one seeks to replace the other, there should not be an overlap. So regardless of what you may have gotten from the old GE rules, and I think that may be why the department's been lax in sending out completers list, but now that they see, oh, okay, EA is really the wave of the future, so let's now resurrect 24 reporting, 25 reporting, give schools until January of 27 to get this information, because we really, really, really want to get this going under the EA standards in 2027. So I think you're starting to see a slow and unpublished phase out of gainful employment. That's just my analysis looking at it from the outside.
Okay, it looks like that is all the questions that we have. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, spending part of your day with us. And thank you so much to Don for hosting and all of the important information.
Sure, my pleasure. Everyone enjoy their day, enjoy their week, and wish you all to be God blessed. Have a good one.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.